shocking evidence that absolute control of people carries on even after coronavirus has ended. New insights that have stunned even the most pessimistic of futurists regarding the fact that the system of control of every possible aspect of human life and subsequent repression of the same is not just a possibility in some far-off future, but rather a present-day reality. Is this that monster that will far surpass any pandemic that the world has ever seen? How did one fictional novel with its prognosis concerning our dark future lead to the unprecedented horror around the world 70 years ago? When in the year 1949, an English author by the name of George Orwell published his futuristic novel called 1984, at first everybody was absolutely shocked. The story was set in then distant future and portrayed a society where the government was willing to do anything in order to control the narrative, and thus formed a surveillance state where everyone's moves were constantly monitored, whilst at the same time individuals were brutally sanctioned by the bureaucratic structures of the totalitarian state. Ever-present telescreens conveyed and surveilled both public and private spaces through government-sanctioned microphones and cameras, and widespread denunciation and snitching amongst people was fully supported. Upon its movie release in the year 1984, Orwell's story, which was also based on the novel by the same title, gained even more popularity throughout the then free world. And whilst reviews varied, and some tended to stand out more than others, one seemed to stick out above them all. In this one particular review, a completely unusual sentiment of the society as a whole was expressed, and when summarized to just one sentence, it went something like this. After this story, everything that I saw as a problem in my life I can see now is not even remotely comparable to something of this magnitude. Is it possible for something like this to ever happen in the future? The greatest astonishment amongst people was not due to what was said about the totalitarian society, as the world has already experienced it for real, but due to the fact that the society described in the novel was actually made up of Great Britain and United States, countries that were the first in line to defend democracy and to which there was the greatest trust afforded by the free world. For this reason, a vast number of people tended to perceive Orwell's novel as a kind of science fiction one. But what do today's readers or viewers think of that? Are those incredible forecasts from George Orwell's novel 1984 today actually becoming reality? If one was to consider, for example, how a small number of gods actually manages to control a large number of prisoners in prison, the first thing that would generally pop into our minds is that it is due to people being behind bars, barbed wire, and or high fences, all whilst being monitored by dangerous gods. However, this is usually a misconception, since the basis for our impression mostly comes from what we see in movies and our mainstream media, who with such depictions are on one hand trying to dissuade and deter individuals from engaging in criminal acts, something that is deemed as quite a positive act. Reality of the matter is somewhat different. Generally, while only a small number of inmates ever plans on escaping from prison, greater number of inmates actually feels that they have nowhere to go, which is even the case when they're done serving their sentence, and that if they manage to escape, they would sooner or later get caught, be returned to prison, and their problem would get exacerbated whilst new and more drastic punishments would follow. The basic and most significant control in prisons actually hinges on a point system. Each prisoner is initially given a certain number of points and a strict code of conduct that envisages for and outlines their deduction in the most diverse of circumstances and concerning varied types of wrongdoings. Depending on the actual number of points the inmate possesses, they are generally classified into one of three categories, in accordance with which they are then denied the basic rights. The lowest rank, for example, would lose their right to go to or for walks, canteen, cafeteria, access media, or have media monitoring in place, receive visits, their visitation rights would be limited in some way, get packages, and so on. And they may even not be allowed any contact with other inmates, such as they could be placed in solitary confinement. So now, consider this. When people in question are considered to be criminals of some sort, this form of sanctioning and control may seem to be an acceptable solution. But what would you say if such a system came to life beyond the prison walls? Or in other words, if it was at your doorstep? Do you think that this is science fiction, such as that which was depicted in the well-known novel 1984? Or could it possibly be happening today? Do you think that this video was put together by some conspiracy theorist for whom personal publicity is of importance? Or just by someone who still cares and to whom it is important that the general public be presented with the existing facts? Now imagine a society in which a state would issue points to a person who is not considered to be a criminal, so that eventually we would all fall under the so-called point system, through which we could all be controlled, sanctioned, and or worse, for the most diverse forms of offences which had in turn been determined upon by someone else who is allegedly competent to do so. Points could be deducted from us for any kind of offence, from that considered to be the most benign to that considered to be the most complex, like when one crosses a street on a red light, when one behaves inappropriately on the internet due to the fact that they have viewed something considered to contain inappropriate content, when one spreads what the state considers to be hate speech, while they themselves think that it is only a matter of stating something that is already out there, when one refuses pediatric vaccination, or in other words, for their children to get vaccinated against diseases as recommended by the state, when one disputes or challenges the quality of a vaccine, thus knowingly and deliberately undermining the general interest pertaining to protection of public health, when one challenges some lockdown that is to be introduced due to a new invisible enemy. Now consider that above mentioned is something that is part of a social card system, which has been intensively worked on for at least the past 10 years, and which is to come to fruition right now. Initially, it is to be implemented in such a manner so as to cover an area where more than 20% of world's population lives and works, and you are to now draw your own conclusions and parallels between that and the entire course of COVID-19 pandemic. Can totalitarianism, as described in the novel 1984, come to life in a subtle way, even in countries that are the embodiment of democracy? Until about 2 years ago, an extremely small number of people thought that George Orwell wrote a novel that fell under the genre of science fiction. However, consider but a fraction of what happened in the year 2020. Look at what is going on right now, and then at that which has a tendency of further intensifying in the future. If in many large cities across the world there are almost no camera-free streets and or spaces, and every inch is covered by systems that are capable of identifying each one of us through facial recognition that can automatically match a face from a digital frame or a video against a database within 3 seconds and then track us, and new ones are being installed daily, thus broadening the coverage to include even the smallest of towns. Can you imagine what would happen if or when the aforementioned social card system is implemented? This move will not be sudden, but rather a gradual one, as this will ensure the most efficient and effective outcome. Remember the urban myth or fable about the boiling frog, which was based on real facts and not just a metaphorical representation that depicts a situation whereby a frog placed in a pot of boiling water will instantly leap out of it, But a frog placed in a pot filled with pleasantly tepid water, which is then gradually heated up, will remain in the water until it boils to death without even attempting to resist. Instead of the story about the boiling frog, there is something from real life that is classified as psychological tactics for manipulating people 101. It has always been very difficult for an incomparably weaker human being to control a large and strong terrestrial animal, such as an elephant. But that all changed the moment that a technique was discovered that over time proved to be ideally applicable to us. Namely, an elephant cub that is several times weaker than the full-grown animal is kept in place only by a small thin length of rope that is tied to its front leg. No chains, no cages, and it should be obvious that an elephant could at any time break free of its bonds, but for some reason it does not. Its mind has become conditioned into believing that no matter how much it tries, it will never break free of that rope. It believes that the rope can hold it down, and thus after a while, even though it has now gained in strength and size, the elephant stops attempting to get loose. The elephant gets used to the given situation, accepts it as normal, and no longer resists it. So moral of the story revolves around what we think or believe to be true. Should we not tend to envision a different outcome or possibility to a given situation? If someone's aim is for another to do their bidding or something that they might not be willing to do at all that is required is to constantly repeat it to them in an allocated period of time. At some point, they're going to willingly accept that something, and what's more, it will leave room so that even worse things could be imposed on them whilst they remain completely passive about it. As we speak, several dozen companies in the United States are working on introducing various forms of social cards. Similar projects also exist in a number of other countries across the world, which were otherwise at the forefront of lockdowns that were aimed at controlling or suppressing the spread of the coronavirus. Will it all end with the previously mentioned general control of people, or will it go much further than that? Completely irrelevant and devoid of our opinion of him and whether or not we see things in the same manner as he does. But what do you think would happen to us, ordinary people, anywhere on earth, if it was possible for the president of the most powerful country in the world and the backbone of world democracy to be censored and then very openly and publicly banned from social networks simply for having opposed the mainstream media? And all without any counteraction from the state, which is constitutionally supposed to protect every individual's right to freedom of speech. We have all seen that millions of people throughout the world can be placed under house arrest as their countless victims could suffer as a result of an invisible enemy. And that although people lost their jobs, were traumatized, impaired, and their quality of life forever changed, in the end, when it counted, majority of them had still quietly accepted it and moved on. What kind of message does something like this send to those who have or will have an idea of and a plan for the implementation of social cards? What would happen if you accepted something such as this simply because you haven't thought about it long enough? Since just as you were viewing this, you may have had the need to make an important, life-changing decision on exactly where and when you were to meet up with a friend for that amazing drink that could not be postponed, as you simply had to know precisely what. Following the introduction of social cards, will electronic money become the next step which will inevitably turn our society into an electronic camp? Electronic money is the currency that is stored in banking computer systems that comes with increased flexibility and convenience for all involved. Electronic money and virtual currency differ in that electronic money does not change the value of the flat currency, national currency, while virtual currency is not equivalent to any flat currency. So in saying that, we can understand that all digital currency is electronic money, but inverse is not necessarily true. So now, what will happen when paper money is replaced by electronic money? All over the world, preparations for this have been underway for a number of years, and during the COVID-19 pandemic, those efforts have intensified and started to be implemented, all under the notion that it has been proven that a virus can be transmitted through money, which at the same time does not prevent or allow for social distancing to be upheld, thus leaving room for the official premiere to soon take place in the same location where the social card system began, and in doing so propagate the vicious cycle. Is it possible that the instant that electronic money completely displaces paper money, which is considered as something inevitable within the framework of global progress, absolutely every move a person makes will be monitored and statistically analyzed? From buying a newspaper from the street vendor, when, for example, it will be known exactly what someone is looking for and thus where the interests lie, and let's say how often and just how dedicated they are to something, simply based on the budget that they allocated for it, to what they eat, where, when, and with whom they spend their time, and what their overall habits are, to name but a few. Is it possible that at that moment a person whose social rating fell to a certain level could, with just one push of a button, lose their entire savings and even become homeless, or lose the means crucial for covering the legal costs involved in the process that they would have to undertake in order to protect their then threatened rights? Ideally, in practice, social card system could be something that could significantly improve people's quality of life. But the main concern is, who is to decide on the criteria for scoring and sanctioning, and what gives them the right to encroach on my privacy, because I, as a free person, have the right to freedom of thought. In his novel 1984, did George Orwell actually foresee that which has developed out of the social reaction to the coronavirus pandemic? Do you remember that only a couple of months before the onset of COVID-19 pandemic, a meeting called Event 201 was held in New York City? Do you remember that the aim of this event was to simulate an outbreak, and that such a simulation, in this case, accurately predicted almost everything that would happen in the upcoming period? Scenarios such as this have apparently been run on numerous occasions, and it is purely coincidental that this one, based on this particular large family of viruses, to some extent came true. It's also simply coincidental that this particular event was held precisely by those who have offered the world the only solutions to the problem in the form of vaccines. The question that now remains is, according to all statistical and or social movement laws, what is the probability that something like that could all have been completely accidental? Are you aware of the fact that the famous French research scientist Luc Montagnier, who had received a Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine for his work in identifying HIV, is amongst the world-renowned scientists who independently of one another detected partial similarities between HIV and COVID-19 genomes, which according to all the laws of medicine and biology should not have appeared there naturally, but could have artificially? Following this, another surprising fact lies in the fact that they were all subsequently labeled as conspiracy theorists. Why is it that they weren't extended the courtesy of what has been considered as common practice in medicine for a very long time, partaking in any expert or public debates? Did you know that in the field of robotics there are various projects that are underway, one of which is development of drones of various sizes and flexibility, with a special emphasis being placed on ones that involve AI and facilitate autonomous functioning? In view of this, some people think that this form of innovative technology is one of the most represented and sought-out branches related to the field of security technology that has been developed in order for governments to gain control over ordinary people, all under the pretext of it being done in order to prevent criminal offenses or unimaginable events that present danger not only to our society but to the offenders themselves. In one of the largest and most powerful countries in the world, They are being introduced into the police force, whilst the project is not being scrutinized by other nations that are considered to be backbones of world democracy. And the reason for them not openly opposing such projects could possibly lie in the fact that they themselves plan on doing the same. Something that can be ascertained not only through official documents, but also through development projects that are underway and that are financed either directly by the state or through related private companies. Is it possible? Is it possible that at some stage a new invisible enemy will appear, which will be extremely unpredictable and detectable only by way of an elevated body temperature, so that measuring our body temperature becomes a new norm and precondition for accessing any public place and public space, such as transportation facilities, shops, schools, parks, and so on? Unless one has gotten vaccinated with a specifically formulated vaccine, or maybe a drug that won't be as invasive and controversial as a vaccine, that we might even be required to get at precisely defined time intervals, given that it will be impossible to eradicate that infectious agent in its entirety. I sincerely hope that my previous statement is purely a fictional one that will serve only as a warning. But you yourself consider whether it makes sense for the described to happen after all, if in just the past year and a bit, everything that you could never have predicted, even in our worst nightmares, has already come true. In 2005, George Orwell's novel 1984 reached Time magazine's 100 Best English Language Novels published since 1923. Together with his other well-known work with similar content called Animal Farm, and with the advent of COVID-19 pandemic, it has become one of the most coveted titles in bookstores worldwide, while at the same time its movie ratings and viewing time jumped sharply, with a tendency of further accelerated growth. It is one of the top literary works that has been translated into multiple foreign languages. On the other hand, distribution of the novel and/or the movie has been banned or sanctioned in various ways in many countries, including those that are considered to be bastions of democracy, and which we will not discuss further on this occasion, as it could be misunderstood and seen as our interfering in politics. George Orwell wrote a novel towards the end of his life with great effort and sacrifice, since he was already seriously ill at the time. The trailer for the previously mentioned movie can be found as part of the video description. According to an opinion of a large number of prominent individuals, the greatest achievement of the 20th century is not considered to be the emergence of great innovations and innovative technologies which have reshaped the world, such as artificial intelligence, nuclear energy, technology development regarding space travel, and so on, but rather something entirely different: compromise. Because people were, for the first time since the beginning of history, able to come to an agreement on some key issues in society that suited all parties involved, and did so mostly by avoiding conflict in most problematic of situations. Here we completely agree with that, but feel that one very important fact must be mentioned as well, and that is that we must absolutely never compromise when it comes to the truth. Some well-meaning individual would add the word moral to this mix, which sounds quite right. However, moral is still something that depends on one's own perception of the world, and as such is a rather relative notion. One of the greatest mysteries of any society is how we constantly allow others to do bad things to us, although the knowledge we possess about the past, history, or present-day situations clearly warn us of such things, for which, according to recent study, the answer lies in the following surprising fact. A vast majority of people who encounter extreme danger from other people, be it individual, a group, or even an entire society, will react in one of two ways. Firstly, We will tend to deny the existence of any danger by telling ourselves that the information isn't accurate, that it's exaggerated, and so on. Or in other words, we will tend to run away from the truth. And secondly, we will see the truth but won't have the willpower to resist the source of danger, which will lead to us trying to submit to the other side, and from this in particular will come our need to justify our actions, which we will then use to support our own poltroonery, which is the final act that could in part be explained by a psychological response, such as the famous Stockholm Syndrome. On the other hand, explanation for this could be found in the fact that one is simply not capable of withstanding a great deal of mental strain for an extended period of time. Or in other words, just as they're incapable of enduring certain physical pain, these individuals could simply be too weak to bear the unusually high psychological pressure placed upon them. For this reason, bad things such as war, manipulation, and various other forms of extreme imperilement still exist, although they could be prevented with just a bit of attitude adjustment on our part. We ought to realize that a problem should be solved as soon as it arises, rather than when it has already culminated.
Something like 1984 could happen. This is the direction the world is going in at the present time. In our world, there will be no emotions except fear, rage, triumph and self-abasement. The sex instinct will be eradicated. There will be no loyalty except loyalty to the party. But always there will be the intoxication of power. Always, at every moment, there will be the thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. The moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen. It depends on you.